The next thing I wanted to know was, okay, so the 7-step process is great for getting started, but how can we take that a level deeper? How can we tell stories that are really outstanding at communicating the core essence of your value? So, and I've always been interested in literature. I studied English. I studied literature at A level when I was at school, and I remember some friends who studied engineering and physics laughing at me because they said I was doing an A level in reading books, and I knew that that wasn't true. I knew that literature was important, but I just couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And it's only now, years later, that I finally realise why it's so important. Because of this kind of communicating knowledge, communicating shared values. That's what makes storytelling so important. And a few years ago, a friend recommended that I picked up a copy of Christopher Booker's book, The Seven Basic Plots. So I've heard various stories, in the last few years of how there are so many basic plots that underpin great literature. And I've seen people talk about the hero's journey, where great stories are supposed to follow a specific story pattern called the hero's journey, and the hero's journey allegedly frames the stories that we consume, and even the story of our own lives. And that's always been interesting to me, but I've never quite seen how to apply that to a marketing email until I read the 7 Basic Plots. So in the 7 Basic Plots, Christopher Booker analyzes all sorts of stories across thousands of years, across different cultures. And what he says is that the great stories of this world can actually be categorized by 7 plots. And each of these plots follows the same underlying story pattern. And that pattern looks like this. And they all illustrate this pattern from different perspectives. So a comedy plot will illustrate the underlying pattern from a different perspective to the tragedy plot. But as I'll explain in a second, they all follow this pattern. So it's a 5-step process. So we start off and we have the call at the beginning. So dark riders turn up in the Shire, and the hero is called to take some course of action, go on some kind of adventure. In step 2, we have the progress stage where our hero makes some kind of progress. Things seem to be going quite well. We seem to be progressing towards the inevitable happy ending. But then we have this downturn. We have the frustration phase where things unravel, things go wrong, things become confusing. And eventually we have the climax of the story between we have some kind of battle or conflict between the dark forces in the story and the good forces. And eventually the good forces prevail, the kingdom returns to its natural state, and the hero is left in an image of unity by winning the heart of the princess, for example. And that sounds really cliche, but that's actually how that structure is how the stories that really last. That's the structure that these great stories follow. And you can do one or two things. You can ignore that structure, and you can create a story that breaks away from that pattern. But the problem is that when you break away from the pattern, you create a story that's deeply unsatisfying to your audience. Your audience wants the happy ending. When I was studying literature, one of the books we studied was A Clockwork Orange. And if you read, so the film version of A Clockwork Orange is slightly different to the book. But in the book basically finishes with Alex, who's the main character in the story, going back to raping, pillaging, being on the rampage. And it's almost like, well, what was the point in the story? The whole point of the story actually is just to shock you, not to illustrate any major character change. And because of that, we remember the violence, but the story doesn't stay with us and it doesn't teach us anything. So let's move on and have a look at each of the plots in turn. So the first plot, and perhaps the most useful plot, is overcoming the monster. Overcoming the monster stories include things like Jaws, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Jumanji, The Hobbit. And in a way, Overcoming the Monster is perhaps the most useful story. It's possibly the most useful story to use because all of the badness is contained within the monster. It's in that sense, it's not a very complicated story. The hero is the goodness in the story, or the good energy, and the monster, whoever that is, whether it's a nightmare boss, a nightmare employee, a nightmare customer, a nightmare business partner, you can really play them up as being the monster. And the reason that the Overcoming the Monster plot gets our attention is because we already have the monster story running in our heads. So in the UK, there are thousands of sightings every year of big cats. So things like pumas, for example. Literally thousands of sightings. And we can categorically say that there are no big cats in the UK in the 21st century. Big cats leave very conspicuous evidence of their presence. They have dens, they have scratching posts. It's really obvious when they're around, and there are definitely none here. Yeah, every year there are thousands of sightings, and the reason is because in evolutionary terms, the threat of big cats has only very recently receded from the human genetic memory. And your lizard brain is always trying to keep you safe from big cats. So if your brain sees anything that looks even vaguely like a big cat, your brain fills in the gaps, sees the big tiger, and tells your legs to run. which is what happens. So that's why Overcoming the Monster story works, because we're already haunted by all of these monsters from our past that your brain is already on the lookout for. So in an Overcoming the Monster story, we still have the 5 phases. We have the opening phase where we're introduced to the monster. So in Star Wars, for example, we're introduced to the Death Star blowing up a planet. We then have the progress phase where the rebels make some progress against the Death Star. We then have the frustration phase where Darth Vader holds up all progress, and the final battle, and then eventually the rebels win out. That's kind of the pattern, how it works. And so examples of how you might use this in your marketing emails. I'm not going to read all of these through for you, but bosses, employees, customers, competitors, colleagues. The thing to do is if you're going to use an Overcoming the Monster story, is to really make sure that the monster does feel like the monster, and not give them any redeeming features. So I've included an example of an Overcoming the Monster story in my book, Simple Story Selling, so you can have a read of that a little bit later. Plot 2 is Rags to Riches. So, we're all familiar with the Rags to Riches story. To an extent, Rags to Riches plays out in our own lives to varying degrees. Examples include Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, Aladdin, The Ugly Duckling, and again we have this sort of five phase development in the plot, where we're introduced to Aladdin. He's struggling to find bread. He then makes some good progress. He finds the lamp and the genie, and then we have this frustration phase where Princess Jasmine rejects his advances, and he gets caught by the guards and has to fight Jafar, and eventually he wins out by acting as his true, real self. And that's the development in the story, is because there's real character development. And the point of the story isn't just to illustrate, great battles and big explosions. It's to illustrate how a character has grown up. It's a growing up story, and that's what makes Rags to Riches so engaging, is because we engage with the growing up aspect of the story. So there's a few ways that you can use this in your own stories. You can tell your personal story. You can tell the story about how your company came to exist. If you're not the business owner, you could tell a story about your founder. All of these make good Rags to Riches stories. The third story is the quest. So examples of quests could be travel nightmares, expeditions, journeys, visiting a customer, the thing about a quest is it's always a physical journey and it always involves helpers. So in Lord of the Rings, for example, we have the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, who support the main characters on the quest. So again, we have this sort of 5-step development where, we have the call in the beginning where the hobbits set out on the quest. They make good progress, then they get held up, then they have a final battle with Sauron, and eventually everything returns to its rightful state. For me, using the quest story was a little bit tricky in my own marketing because I personally don't travel very much. The quest is more useful, if you have any kind of expeditions business, then there'll be loads and loads of quest stories that you can use. If you travel a lot, there's probably a lot of quest stories that you can use, especially if Delta Airlines have anything to do with it. So I would always be on the lookout for quest stories, but this is the key thing about the plot archetypes, is that you don't need to use all of them. You just need to know what they all are, and then some of them will resonate with you more than others, and then you pick one or possibly two to use at the very core, to use at the key points in your marketing to deliver a really powerful story that really delivers the information that you need to build trust. The fourth plot is comedy. So comedy is a slightly more complicated plot, I guess. But it still follows the same pattern, but in this case, the dark force or the bad force in the story is confusion. So we always start off, and comedy is really about confusion over people's true identities. So we start off and things seem to go well, but what happens is the key characters in the story fall in love with the wrong people, and they get really frustrated, and eventually we have this big moment of clarity where they see, oh, that wasn't my true love, that was my true love. And then eventually the story works out and we get a happy ending. So this is actually quite versatile in business use. So you can talk about any time where there have been major confusions. So confusions about roles, misunderstandings between you and a customer, misunderstandings between you and a supplier, office romances. And the key thing about comedy is it doesn't actually have to be funny. So I use the comedy structure a lot in my stories. And maybe it is, depending on your sense of humour, maybe you find my dry British approach mildly amusing, but it doesn't have to be fall off your chair funny. That's a very modern interpretation on comedy. The key point about comedy is this sort of network of confusion, and the point of the plot is that the confusion is eventually worked out and people eventually see other characters for who they really are. And that's the point of the story. Tragedy is actually very similar to comedy, except that we don't get the happy ending. So if tragedy sounds like something that you would never ever want to use in a marketing email, please hear me out. And I think it's fair to say that tragedy isn't a plot that you will use very often. But the point of a tragedy story is it gets your reader to stop and it gets them to think. It stops them in their tracks and it draws their attention to something that's really important, some real danger to them, some potential pitfall that could stop them achieving what they want to achieve. And this raises a really important point, because I think that if you're only ever delivering positive messages to your customers, you're basically treating them like children. And you need to be pointing out real problems to them. So if, for example, let's say you were out in your driveway collecting your mail and you saw a ball bounce into the road and you saw a child run out to collect the ball, and at the top of the road you can see a van coming. The van isn't stopping, the child isn't stopping, it's going to be a collision course. What message do you shout out? Do you shout out a positive message, or do you shout out a negative message? And it's the negative message you shout out, because it's the negative message that gets the child to stop and think. So things like death of a person, death of a product, death of a dream, death of ambition. But actually the plot structure is the same. So if you think about Macbeth as an example, we have the opening situation where Macbeth is under King Duncan. He's a respected general. But then he killed King Duncan, and for a while things seem to go quite well for Macbeth. He seems to get away with the murder, but then things go wrong. And we get this frustration phase. Banquo comes back and haunts him. Macduff finds out what he's done. And we eventually have this big conflict where eventually Macbeth is killed. But we still end up in stage 5 because the Kingdom of Scotland returns to its harmonious balance. So the outcome of the story is still a renewal of life and a renewal of energy. It's just that the dark character in this case is also the hero of the story. But we still get this overall plot pattern. So again, I have an example of the tragedy plot in business use in my book, Simple Story Selling. Plot 6 is Voyage and Return. So a classic example of a Voyage and Return plot is Back to the Future. Alice in Wonderland is another Voyage and Return story. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a Voyage and Return story. And the point about Voyage and Return is that the return part is always more difficult than the voyage. It's never a problem getting to 1955. It's more of a problem getting back. So we get this, the same pattern again. So stage 1 is the call, where Martin McFly inadvertently ends up in 1955. For a while, things seem, strange and interesting. But then things become a bit more frustrating. He realizes that he needs to get home. He doesn't want to have to play father to his own dad. And we get this big climax in the story where we're not sure, are they going to hit 80 miles an hour before the lightning hits the town clock? And eventually, of course, they do, when we end up with the 5th stage of the story. So how would you apply that in a business setting? Well, it doesn't have to necessarily be a physical voyage and return. It could be, anytime you've taken a job that turned out not to be what you thought. Anytime where you got into a market that turned out not to be what you thought and you had to work hard to get back to your core business. Anytime that you opened up a business in the wrong location, that's another voyage and return story. A voyage and return story could also be social. It could be a time when you mistakenly became involved in a business group or a business community. Finally, plot 7 then is Rebirth. So I've included Shrek here as an example of Rebirth. But Shrek's an interesting example because Shrek actually is many of the plots rolled into one. So we have Rebirth, we have The Quest, we have Voyage and Return. But again, we still get this plot pattern where the frustration stage in the middle is the stage where the hero of the story is kind of frozen in some sense of darkness or in some kind of dark state. So an example of a rebirth story is A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge is kind of frozen in this dark state, and it's only when he's seen all 3 of the ghosts and he's eventually rescued by Tiny Tim does he see the light and return, to the 5th stage. So Scrooge is another example of a rebirth story where Scrooge himself is almost reborn in his perspective on how he views things. And that's how you can use the rebirth story in business. It's about times when you've had a fundamental change in perspective, a fundamental change in business direction, any sort of midlife crises that have impacted your business and the way that you work. These are all really engaging story topics and great things for you to write about and put at the core of your marketing, because when you explain this, people start to understand what you believe in. And that's really the point. It's when people understand what you believe in that they then start to trust you more. The key thing about the plot archetypes is to pick one. So don't try and write a story about each of the 7 archetypes. Just pick one that resonates with you. So As I've been explaining this, you'll probably have thought of a story for one of the plots that you think, yes, I can work with that. I can get going with that. And I think the obvious place to use an archetypal story like this is a sort of welcome sequence, or sometimes it gets called an indoctrination sequence, which I think is a stupid name, but anyway. But the point at which a contact opts in for your marketing or first buys from you, I think it's a great place to introduce one of these plots where you're introducing what you stand for, you're introducing, how your purpose was reborn, or you're introducing how you overcame a monster in some way, shape, or form to get to where you are today. And it entertains people. It entertains people, but it also educates them at the same time. So just pick one plot and try adding it as your welcome sequence, and see how it impacts your results.